My name is Blair Rubel. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Comparative Urban Studies project, and I welcome you here today. If nothing else, this event has brought together a number of us here at the center, and I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. First and foremost, the Asian Development Bank, and you'll be hearing from Douglas Brooks about their work. But I also would like to thank the Wilson Center's, my colleagues at the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China in the U.S., the Asia Program, the China Environment Forum, and the Program on America and the Global Economy. A lot of people joined together to make this meeting possible, but I particularly want to single out Sandy Foe. I don't know if Sandy's in the room or outside, but she is the person who literally got us all in the room here this morning, so I want to be sure to acknowledge her role. The topic of green urbanization in Asia is obviously an important one, and as evidenced by the number of people who are interested in co-sponsoring this event and the number of you who are willing to show up the last week of August at 9 in the morning. I think that is a sign of the topic's importance. We know that millions of people are migrating to cities throughout Asia, as elsewhere in the world, and we also know that the environmental impact of urbanization can be extensive with potential positive benefit to the environment as well as the potential for great harm. So where is the green in urbanization in Asia, and what is the state of play of perhaps the greening of urbanization in Asia? The ADB's recent report on green urbanization in Asia is a seminal document, and you'll hear why in the presentation, and I hope you'll have a chance to take a look at the document. Douglas Brooks is just the right person to introduce the document to you. He is Assistant Chief Economist and Director of Development Indicators and Policy Research Division at the Asian Development Bank, and his research focuses mostly on areas of international trade and investment. And he's also worked as the Acting Director of Research and Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo, and as Director of the Country Economic Analysis Department of the Export-Import Bank of Japan and the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. He is an economist in the United Nations system, with the U.S. government, and in academia. Douglas, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present our work and to talk to you all. The Asian Development Bank each year puts out a publication, Key Indicators for Asia and the Pacific, which has a wealth of statistical information about the region, the countries in the region. And it also has a theme chapter which covers a different topic each year. And this year the topic for the theme chapter was green urbanization in Asia. So that's what we'd like to talk about. This was a team project, and one of the lead authors on the team, Guanghua Wan, is over here in the blue shirt. You may notice his name is on the presentation. We share a lot of things, so we decided we'd share this. I will do the work, he will take the credit. I'll make him answer the hard questions too, though, so he'll pay for it. Okay, the main things we'd like to point out is that Asia's urbanization is different than what's gone before it in other parts of the world in some key ways. We'll talk about what those are. This leads to enormous challenges, and foremost among those may be environmental degradation. But there are also ways in which urbanization can help the environment, as Mr. Rubel mentioned. So to ensure the best possible outcome, policies should exploit the unique features of Asia's urbanization and its latecomers' advantage, that much of the urbanization is still in the future for Asia. Unprecedented, just the massive numbers in Asia tend to overwhelm everything. In the 30 years from 1980 to 2010, more than 1 billion people, new people moved into Asia's cities. So that's just the change in the urban population over that period of time. Over the next 30 years, we expect another billion people to move into Asia's cities. So just the numbers are a bit staggering. And you can see, as you might expect, most of them are in China and India, but also the other large countries in the region. So what makes Asia different? For one thing, the speed at which urbanization is taking place. Latin America and the Caribbean took over 200 years to move from 10% urban population to 50%. In North America, took over 100 years, Europe 150 years. In Asia and the Pacific, we see the same thing taking place in less than 100 years, 95 years. And China, down at the bottom, roughly 60 years for the same phenomenon to take place. So these are massive numbers of people moving very rapidly with a big impact on the social and economic features of the region and on the world, I should point out. The second feature particular about Asia is the density of the cities. This chart shows the world's top 25 cities ranked by density. The 3 most densely populated cities in the world are all in South Asia. 8 of the 10 most densely populated cities in the world are in Asia. Density has good points and bad points, and we'll talk about more of those. Providing infrastructure is a little easier to reach more people, but the spread of contagious diseases, things like that, have downsides as well. Megacities. So many people moving into the cities, the size of the cities tends to get very large. In 2010, the world had 23 megacities defined by this is UN data. Megacity is defined as a population of 10 million or more. Out of the 23 megacities in the world in 2010, more than half of them were in Asia already. But Asia still has a low overall level of urbanization, that the share of the population in urban areas is lower in Asia and the Pacific than any other region, except Africa nowadays. And it's lower than the world average, which suggests that there's still a long way to go in Asian urbanization. Projecting up to the year 2050, the share of Asia's population in urban areas would increase from 43% to 63%, but still be below the world average. So it would be likely to continue farther than that. Again, these are United Nations projections. We've mentioned the megacities in Asia, and they tend to be the biggest cities in their countries, but there's an empirical regularity in the urban economics literature about the pattern of sizes of cities, the relationship between the size of the second biggest city to the largest one, the size of the third biggest city to the largest one, and so on. And based on that pattern, Asia looks like the biggest cities are still going to grow much bigger. The share of the urban population in the largest city in each country in Asia averages 12%, while in the rest of the world it averages 21%. So even though we've got so many people in such large cities in Asia, compared to the rest of the world, that trend is likely to continue. So by the year 2025, we project even more megacities in the world with even a higher concentration in Asia. By the year 2025, the UN expects there to be 37 megacities in the world, with 21 of them in Asia. Okay, so challenges that go along with this rapid, dense, large-scale urbanization. Inequalities have been growing throughout the region, income inequality in particular. We've also been doing some work looking at other aspects of inequality, non-income inequality. And the Key Indicators publication has a supplement, a framework of inclusive growth indicators that goes through more of those, if anyone is interested. These documents are all available online for free. The crime rates, everybody knows bigger cities tend to have more crime on average. Expansion of slums, we'll come back to this a little more. Largest share of the world's slum dwellers are in Asia. It's over 500 million people. And above all, environmental degradation. We'd like to concentrate on 2 aspects of that, pollution and vulnerability to flooding. Okay, looking at air pollution. We've used a measure of air pollution PM10, that's particulate matter, 10 microns or less or more in diameter. And it's usually measured in terms of 100 micrograms per cubic meter. And cities in the world with the PM10 above 100 micrograms per cubic meter, there are 57 of them. 34 of them were in Asia. The green line that cuts across at the bottom is the EU standard for what is a healthy or an acceptable level of pollution. I shouldn't say healthy, but at least acceptable. And you can see that all of these are well above that. That level is 40 micrograms per cubic meter, while some of the ones in Asia go up over 300, 350. Huge amounts of pollution in the air. And the red bars in this chart are the Asia-Pacific cities. And out of Asian cities, 67%, 2/3, failed to meet this EU standard for particulate matter in the air. So there's a lot of air pollution to deal with. Carbon dioxide emissions, another measure of pollution. The PM10 is primarily a local pollution matter. It's something that doesn't move too far from the source that emits it, so it tends to mostly affect the people living in that area, in the urban area where it's originating. While CO2 contributes to global warming, so it's a global problem. Between the years 2000 and 2008, per capita CO2 emissions in Asia grew 97%, almost doubled. While in the rest of Asia, they only grew 18%. Well, in non-Asia, they only grew 18%. So the level of pollution is increasing much more rapidly in Asia. And this is something with global consequences. Of the top 5 CO2 emitting economies, of the top 5, 3 of them are in Asia: China, India, and Japan. Again, so Asia is, some people would count Russia as part of Asia. By that standard, 4 out of 5. Our definition of Asia is limited to ADB's member countries. And it looks likely that the environment may degrade further before things start getting better. In economics, there's what's known as a Kuznets curve, named after Simon Kuznets, a Nobel laureate, which argued that inequality tends to increase over time as countries develop before they reach a reasonable level of income, and then things start getting better. That work has been extended to the environment with what's known as an environmental Kuznets curve. So this one is for carbon dioxide emissions per capita. And the curve, like that, an inverted U pattern showing it worsening before it improves. Our estimate for Asia has a peak of around $41,000 per capita income. Current levels of income per capita in Asia are a little over 6,000. So there's still a long way to go to reach that peak based on current conditions. Also under current conditions, business as usual type scenario, carbon dioxide emissions per capita may triple, moving from 3.5 to over 10. When you have billions of people in Asia's cities producing carbon dioxide at this rate, not just the people, but the industries, the transportation, everything that goes along with them, it's a serious problem for the globe, for the whole planet. Besides the pollution, Asia is also more vulnerable to flooding, both along the coasts and inland. Looking first at the coastal flooding, I should mention this was a scenario developed by a couple of professors at NYU, and their measure of coastal flooding is a sea level rise of 10 meters. Okay, that's rather extreme by most standards, so these are probably an upper edge. On the other hand, in the last 10 years, Asia has suffered 2 devastating tsunamis. So by those measures, 10 meters is not that unusual, and it is something to be concerned about. Over 250 million people would be at risk in Asia, 18% of the urban population. Okay, the flooding is mostly clustered in China, South and Southeast Asia. We've got Thailand, Bangkok headed here because that's where we launched this report, just to highlight that. But you can see it's mostly, mostly China and a bit of India, Indonesia, and a few other countries. Inland flooding, the top 15 Asian cities, again, mostly China. Very large percentage of the population at risk, 99% of Phnom Penh, over 80% for Wuhan, Palembang, more than half for quite a few out of these countries, and out of these cities. These are just the top 15 cities with population over 1 million. Many smaller cities would also be affected as well. With more urbanization, more people would be at risk. Not surprising. The numbers at risk of coastal flooding expected to increase from 300 to over 400 million, and from inland flooding from 245 to over 340 million. So hundreds of millions of people in Asia at risk of flooding in the urban areas. And the special features that I mentioned earlier can make some of these challenges even more dangerous. The fact that Asia has a low level of urbanization means there's still a long way to go, likely, before it stabilizes or peaks. The fast speed at which urbanization is taking place means that changes are taking place probably more rapidly than the policymakers can handle, that there's little time to adjust. Building infrastructure is generally a long-term prospect of these type of learning the lessons and adapting to them is difficult when the changes come so quickly. The growth of the megacities, both more of them and larger sizes of them, mean they're going to be harder to manage properly and effectively, and more slums means more people vulnerable to flooding, as we mentioned, to pollution, to contagious diseases, to many other factors associated with low levels of living in slums. But we also see positive aspects in urban agglomerations. Generally, cities, the production shifts to services rather than manufacturing, and service sectors tend to pollute less than manufacturing in general. What happens to the manufacturing? Well, a lot of it relocates out of the city center, either to the edges of the city or to special economic zones or to smaller cities where less people would be directly affected. The density of the population, as I mentioned, makes it easier to provide infrastructure and services for these people. Now, one thing I'll come back to is a pattern that we see emerging in Asia of the megacities surrounded by satellite cities. And if the satellite cities are linked by public transportation, green public transportation, that can help the environment quite a bit and help to minimize some of the congestion, some of the needs for other infrastructure as well. Quality of life, urban agglomeration brings many good factors together that people enjoy. Generally, people move to urban areas by choice rather than force. Innovation and higher labor productivity. Some studies suggest labor productivity may be 3 times higher in the urban areas than in the rural areas. And they're centers for innovation, bringing together clusters of smart people with common interests and allowing them to interact with each other more easily. People are more likely to own property if they've moved into the cities, and that gives them a stronger stake in the environment. Also, middle class, higher levels of education associated with that. Looking at data from the World Values Study, we find that people who are more educated and more urban tend to be more willing to sacrifice some of their income, even some of the economic growth, for the sake of protecting the environment. Decomposing the impacts of urbanization on the environment. The pure growth impact is likely to be negative. That's the one most people focus on. As you have more economic activity, it does tend to impact on the environment more. But the composition, the types of industries that are fostered in cities, the changes in the composition of economic activity, in general, tend to be positive. Technical effects, the technological development, shift towards greener technologies over time. Those type of things tend to take place more in the urban areas with positive effects. Asia is a latecomer. We mentioned the low level of urbanization in Asia. That means there's still and with a long way to go, but that means there's a lot of time to take advantage of things that have already been developed. Research and development for new technologies, adopting greener technologies. We see that across Asia, and most notably in China, there's a lot of efforts to develop new green technologies and to export them. So Asian urbanization may be not only helping the environment in Asia, but also in other parts of the world as well through these green technology exports, and for adopting regulations in a timely manner. Coming back to the Kuznets curve, this time rather than looking at income and pollution, we're looking at levels of urbanization and pollution. Again, for the PM10, local pollution, and CO2, the contributions to global pollution. You can see that in both cases, we're still not at the peak. But over time, moving from the 1990s to the 2000s, the curve has changed, partly due to developments in technology, changes in the way people live, hopefully some better policies as well. The curves have been shifting down and to the left, so there's hope that this improvement will continue over time as well. And good policies hopefully can shift the curves even further or faster. We mentioned the system of megacities with the satellite cities. Also, we see other variations of green cities, compact cities, eco-cities. Singapore in Asia is a good example of a pretty green city. Exploiting the latecomer advantage, import or research and development, smart electric grids, recycling through circular economies, clean energy. There's a lot of new technologies that as the countries are still, as the cities are still growing and building new infrastructure, they can take advantage of these new technologies and embed them in their own systems. Introduction of regulations, better financing, and political government transparency, things like pollution or emission pricing, carbon tax or cap and trade system, reducing the subsidies where they're inefficient, block pricing for public utilities, and so on. So to conclude, we think it's probably not going to work trying to contain urbanization in Asia. The forces are too strong, and there are advantages to having systems of cities of different sizes. But urbanization must be steered into a green path that exploits its own unique features. As I mentioned, that left on its own, the prospects are not good. The levels of CO2 production, the emissions of particulate matter, and so on could have very serious consequences. So there is a need to clean up the future development of Asia's cities. And we believe it is possible with good policies. So with that, I'd like to stop there. Thank you, and remind you that all the publications are available on our website. But they are being polished up to final form, which will be out in September. There's preliminary versions available now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a comprehensive overview of a large amount of material. I'll open it up in a second, but I wanted to begin, I wanted to ask that maybe you disaggregate the discussion a little bit and talk about differences in Asia, and to give some structure to that, I just wanted to note that the World Urban Forum, run by UN Habitat, is next week in Naples. It's the 6th World Urban Forum. There have been a number of meetings leading up to WOOF, as it's called, next week. And there are a couple of variations that emerge from discussions of African and Latin American cities. So I'd like to highlight those points as a way to maybe get you to tease out a little bit how Asia might be different. In the African case, there are 2 points that are often made about contemporary urbanization. If you note, Africa is also a continent that's beginning to undergo rapid urbanization. The first is that while there are livelihood opportunities in cities, taking the traditional North American, European, and even Latin American model of viewing people moving from the countryside into cities for work in the formal economy really no longer holds up. And that many of the livelihood opportunities in cities exist in the informal sector, and that the pattern of urbanization taking place in Africa is not really movement into the traditional formal city, but into vast peri-urban areas which are dominated in many, many ways by informal structures. So one question is, do we see that pattern any place in Asia? A second pattern which one sees in Africa and still sees in Latin America, even though Latin America is the most, South America is the most urbanized continent, is that movement is no longer to megacities but to secondary cities, and it's the secondary cities that are growing most rapidly. And finally, since I mentioned Latin America, the conventional wisdom has emerged that Latin America has been especially effective at confronting the governance challenges you mentioned around issues of basically facing challenges that are overwhelming. And they've been effective over the last 10 to 20 years because of an increasing reliance on participatory governance mechanisms, so that the ability of societies to respond to crises is shared between official institutions, community institutions. So do you see any of these patterns in Asia, and as you talk about it, maybe disaggregate Asia a little bit?
Okay, thank you. Sure, the informal sector is something that's still very prevalent in Asia as well. Our own estimate is about 2/3 of employment in Asia is informal employment, in developing Asia, I should say. In terms of the rural-urban migration, there's a number of studies that have shown that rather than moving from rural areas directly to megacities, there is a pattern of moving from rural areas to small towns, to small cities, to bigger cities, and so on like that. So it's not a clear one-step process, but it's a multi-step process. And hopefully along the way, I'm sure for different individuals, it would be different numbers of steps before they make it into the formal sector. But there is a lot of informal employment even in Asia's cities. And I mentioned that the slums in Asian cities account for most of the world's slum dwellers, a little over 500 million slum dwellers in Asian cities who are, almost by definition in the informal sector. And then there's much other informal employment as well. So it is a serious factor, and it's a struggle in Asia as well as everywhere else. If the government provides the public services for these people, then that tends to attract more people into the cities as well. So it's hard to figure out the proper balance there, except for trying to develop the rural areas more and slow down the process. Along with the secondary cities growing most rapidly, that's probably true in Asia as well. We didn't have the data to look at that because most of them are, as I mentioned, the speed at which Asia is urbanizing means you don't get much time series data to look at how individual cities, the smaller ones in particular, have developed over time. Yes, and effectiveness at confronting the challenges. We do have more detailed recommendations in the publication. We think that, yes, Latin America has had a lot of success. At the regional level, Latin America has been reducing inequality in recent years, while in Asia it seems to still be increasing. Of course, the level of inequality is still lower in Asia than in Latin America, but the trend is a little disturbing. Some very recent evidence suggests that inequality in Asia may have peaked and begun to start decreasing, but we're not fully confirmed on that yet. Yes, the transparency we think is particularly important, and we've suggested some mechanisms by having competitions between cities, having peer pressure to kind of a blame and shame type of mechanisms to make the governments take into consideration the impacts of their policies, not just on individuals, but on the environment as well.
Thank you. Well, we're now open. We have a comfortable amount of time for questions, comments. We'll go right here to this gentleman up here. We'll get you a microphone.
Yeah, testing, yeah.
Please identify yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative in Washington. The picture you've painted here, although you're focusing on urbanization, you're also suggesting that the population levels are out of balance with natural resources. If you talk about a global challenge associated with CO2 emissions being so large, I mean, what we're basically saying there is that the system is out of balance with nature. And we see that too. We look at China, and it's using 250% of ecological resources compared to what it has, and the same for India. So I'm wondering a couple of things. One is, when you develop indicators, why don't you look at a natural resource sufficiency balance sheet kind of an indicator? Is one question. And the second question I have is how can, if the whole system is out of balance and not sustainable, how can you have a green city in a context when the entire system, the global system, is not in balance and not sustainable? Thank you.
Why don't we go ahead?
Okay. In terms of population being out of balance with nature, that's a lot of that has to do with lifestyles. You know, if people consume a lot less, have a lighter ecological footprint, that type of thing, you may be able to have to sustain a much larger population. The U.S., and I'm American too, you know, is well known for using a huge amount of the world's resources with a very small part of the population. It's not unique to Asia. On the other hand, you have countries in Asia like Kazakhstan or Australia, with Mongolia, with very small populations but huge amounts of natural resources. So at the global level, are we out of balance? Probably so, with current levels of technology and patterns of consumption. Is there a limit to the world's population? I haven't seen anything. I mean, you can go back to the Club of Rome and those sorts of things, but I haven't seen any clear evidence that suggests what is the world's population carrying capacity, because it does depend so much on lifestyles and technology.
Okay, to make it easier for the microphone, we're going to go to State Roy right here, and then we'll go to this gentleman here who's asked for the floor, and then to the back.
Stape Roy with the Kissinger Institute here at the Wilson Center. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Your final conclusion here is that urbanization has to be steered into a green path. But a green path involves current costs as opposed to saving in the future because of all of the environmental damage, health and otherwise, that can increase costs in the long run. You mentioned Singapore as an example of a green city, but Singapore is already at a developed country level of economic development, and the pattern tends to be that while getting to that advanced level of income, people do not follow a green path. My question is there any example of a developing country that has followed or is following a green path that could serve as a model for what you are setting out as the goal? Because otherwise, one is forced to the conclusion the goal is a nice one, but is hopelessly unrealistic in the absence of international inputs to offset the problems of developing countries struggling with inadequate income levels to support a green path.
In terms of current costs versus future costs, economic theory would say the future costs should be discounted so that you have the net present value of what the cost should be, and the decision making should be made on that basis. I mean, and the externalities, the environmental spillover effects and others would be incorporated into those costs in the process. In practice, that's quite difficult to do, you're right. But in terms of where is green urbanization really taking place, I don't think Singapore is an unreasonable example. You don't have to go back too many decades to where Singapore was a pretty low-income country. You know, 1960, there wasn't much there. It's really come up in 50 years. And there's quite a few examples of individual cities around Asia that are taking steps to move towards a greener urban pattern. And we find that quite encouraging. It's generally being done at the level of individual cities rather than whole countries. For Singapore, you get the same thing in one. But
Okay, we have a gentleman who has the microphone, then give the microphone to Jennifer Turner. After Jennifer's question, we'll come to this corner, please.
Hi, yeah, I'm Ethan Goffman from Sustainability, Science Practice, and Policy. I have two questions. The first is about population, because it's one of the key driving factors, and urbanization and is shown to go along with shrinking population and smaller families. So might that be another big environmental long-term benefit of urbanization? But also, you're projecting a growing GDP and growing affluence, but if the environmental effects, right now global warming, it seems, as far as impacts, might be ahead of some of the projected curves. And I mean, I'm wondering if the environmental impact could just throw us off, and this kind of follows from the first question, throw us off the chart so much that we never get the kind of growth that is projected.
Okay.
okay, yes, the fertility effect is definitely part of the picture, and it is something that we've emphasized quite a bit in the chapter. Apparently it didn't make it into the final presentation, and I'm sorry that we overlooked that, but we do discuss it a good amount, and it is one of the, probably the main positive impact of urbanization, is that as people move into urban areas, fertility rates tend to drop, population growth slows, and you have that positive, if not necessarily an impact, positive contribution towards reducing the environmental impact. Environmental impact.
The projections being worse.
Oh yeah, the projections. Sure, the projections, we don't really know. I mean, it's kind of a best guess type of work. And you're right, the environmental impacts could throw that off, and you can create multiple scenarios and look at the impacts of different possible futures. You know, economics is well known for being about on a par with meteorology, or a little below meteorology in its forecasting ability.
Jennifer Turner, and then we'll go to the corner back here.
Hi there. My name is Jennifer Turner. As he just said, I direct the China Environment Forum here, so you can tell that I'm really excited about your publication, because China, we got a lot of big cities growing there. In my work here at the Wilson Center, I focused a lot in the last few years on the water-energy confrontation in China. Specifically, how is energy development impacting water? And now it's called Choke Point China, and we're starting. We've already started Choke Point China Choke Point China Part 2. Sorry, I have a cold, and so we're digging deeper, and we're going to start trying to do some investigation of some cities. And should acknowledge here, ADB is going to help support us in doing my partners in doing this. But I was curious in your study. I know they were mean and they only gave you a little sliver of the full study. Did you look at the water footprint of cities, both in the in the how they're run and the actual construction? I mean, it goes two ways. I mean, energy uses water, but cities themselves also have a large water footprint of the consumption and then also the pollution factor. That's what we're starting to look at now. And I was curious, for totally self-centered reasons, whether or not in this study, if did you guys look at the water footprint, or if you're going to, and and I want to connect with your folks later too. But thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's a very good point. And it's funny, the last time we gave this seminar on Monday at the Asia Society in San Francisco, the point made was that energy and water can be traded off in some cases. And the point that that person was making was that a lot of energy goes into pumping water. Most water is used for irrigation rather than household consumption or things like that. And if you're using a lot of energy to move water around, is that the best possible combination of use of the two inputs? But no, we haven't looked at water footprint yet. We are starting a follow-up study together with the Inter-American Development Bank to look at sustainable urbanization in a comparative framework between what happens in Latin America, what happens in Asia, and using an urban metabolism approach that will focus on inputs and emissions coming out of that process. So hopefully we will be able to give you a much better answer in a year or two.
And we could be here to help too.
Thank you. Please give me your information later.
Okay, we have 3 hands in that corner, so maybe we'll take all 3 of those since the microphone is there. Ray Strike will be first, and then the woman to Ray's right will be second, and the woman to his left will be third, and we'll answer, and then we'll come up to this gentleman.
Thank you. I'd like to bring this down to the local level for a minute. And I mean, I think it's pretty widely recognized that the lack of capacity at the local level on planning, comprehensive planning for efficient urbanization, and ranging from transportation systems that give access to the poor downtown and so on, so they can leave central urban slums and live elsewhere in better conditions, to prevention of future slums, so on and so forth, that this is a major issue in actually making progress. And my question to you is, who among these Asian countries is doing well in training the cadre of future planners, capable planners, and also are working to put incentives in place for them to actually work in this area? A number of countries, this is more Africa than Asia, I don't know Asia that well, that all the infrastructure decisions are essentially being made by national ministries. They allocate a road here, something there, and it really works against comprehensive local planning. And it's very discouraging, and good people get tired of doing it and go away. So if you could just comment on this nexus of issues. Thank you.
And why don't we get the next question right there?
Hi, my name is Li Jianya. I'm a Chinese grad student in Elia School, and thank you for the presentation. I'm very interested in your comparison. In your model of Singapore. I'm a Chinese. I'm more kind of country orientated. So I think that Singapore, I don't think it's very proper as a paradigm for China, because it's like, first we have different economy patterns. Singapore is mainly depends on tourism and transportation, because it's one of the greatest and one of the most important water channel there. But China, on the other hand, rely on manufacture, some kind of heavy industry. And although the private sector, China here is about around 40% of the total GDP, which is not so mature. But we are doing better, but still have time. We still need time to adjust. That is the first thing. The second is we have different population density. That is true. Singapore is that big. So sorry for that. No one from Singapore, right? Yeah, okay, thank you. So it's very easy to conduct that country, city, but China, on the other hand, we are highly political speaking, we are highly concentrated, but it's highly decentralized geographically speaking. And every patch of China has different characters, like Tibet, like Xinjiang. They have different geographical character as well as political issues. The third thing is the more complicated situation faced by China. We have drought, we have threats from the flood. So any specific paradigm for China instead of, generally speaking, Asia?
Okay, why don't we take these two questions, and then when we come back, right, the woman there will have the question, and then the gentleman here, so we should get the microphone to him. Okay.
Thank you. The points about use of public transportation for slum alleviation, I thought was very interesting, very good. The centralization or decentralization of policymaking, particularly infrastructure provision. The way you describe it, it sounds like it's much more centralized in Africa than my impression of much of Asia. That a lot of things are done at the level of individual cities, that the mayor of big cities does have quite a bit of influence, including influence at the central government level in much of Asia. And if you're looking at patterns across cities and within countries, that gets more complicated. Generally, it's kind of a mixture of different things because different cities develop their own levels of infrastructure, their patterns of development on their own, not as part of a centralized plan, so that you get wide variation within individual countries, which kind of links to the question about Singapore and China. That I don't think you can compare Singapore and China as countries, but you might be able to compare Singapore with particular cities in China. One thing China has been doing very well at is trying out or experimenting with types of policies, types of development in particular parts of the country and learning from that experience before making it nationwide, if at all. But I'd like to, if it's okay, I'd like to let my colleague address that point because he knows a lot more about China than I do.
Okay, maybe we'll give you that microphone. Yeah.
I probably can speak. I do probably little. Right. Thanks, Doug. I know a little more about China because I've been working on China in the last 20, 25 years. Urbanization in China is certainly, Asia is different from other regions, and China is very different from other parts of the world, other regions and other countries. I mean, one particular thing, of course, most of us will know is this population control, this hukou system. And to me, we know China's urbanization has been growing very fast. But because of that system in place, so I think it's actually slower than probably it should be. It could be even faster. Now, again, there are positive and negative consequences of that, of course, once you have concentration of people. But if you keep people in the rural areas, and if you keep people in the western, really sort of not so fertile, not so rich areas, the environmental consequence could be more serious. I mean, in northern part where you have the desertation, you have all these sandstorms, and that's largely due to deforestation. And what's happening is people in rural areas cut the trees and even the grass for fuel. So with that, my personal advice to the Chinese government is really they got to look at probably more on the positive side of urbanization to the environment rather than the negative side. And that's what they have been doing in the last 40, 50 years. The government has been trying to contain urbanizing as much as they could. But despite that, the urbanization is proceeding since the mid-80s. What happened is in mid-80s, they did not really, of course, eliminate the hukou system, but what they did is they relaxed the migration restriction. You can restrict, but you don't take your hukou. You're not going to have your welfare, you don't have your education, you don't have your health care, nothing. But you are allowed to move. Yeah. So you find a job, you survive yourself. But with that, since mid and late 80s, we started without migration at all to about 250 million migrants floating in China. And so to me, I think the China should really probably take a more proactive role in promoting urbanization.
Okay, we'll go back to the corner and then this gentleman here.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Cecilia and I'm with Climate Advisors, a former Fulbright fellow in China studying eco-cities there. My question is, you mentioned that in Latin America, participatory governance has had a very positive effect on green urbanization. And I was wondering if you think that that kind of model can be applied to countries in Asia, or if it's appropriate for countries in Asia, for example, China, which has a very top-down approach to urban planning. And what do you think is the best sector to guide green urbanization in Asia?
And we'll get this gentleman. Go ahead.
Thanks. Came in a few minutes late. Did you discuss the difference on this slide here, more human capital, which basically demonstrates that the more education you get, the more you're willing to sacrifice for the environment? You have two figures here. The sacrifice growth and sacrifice income are two different questions, and I guess there's just kind of a disconnect there in my head. It seems like it's kind of difficult to separate being able to sacrifice growth from sacrificing income. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what how those questions were framed, or what that means in terms of public perceptions of the conflicts between growth and environment.
Okay. We'll take these.
Yeah, in terms of the participatory approach, definitely we think that's a way that Asia should be developing more rapidly, that the governments need to be accountable, and transparency is an important part of achieving that. Sacrificing growth versus income. Sorry, I should mention that to keep the presentation short enough so we could have good discussion afterwards, we haven't shown all of the slides here that are in the handout. So the ones you're referring to were not presented as such, but they are there. And as I mentioned, those are based on the World Values Survey data. And it asks different questions, like would you be willing to, I don't have the questionnaire with me, so I don't know the exact phrasing, but the difference is, would you be willing to accept, say, 5% annual growth in the economy rather than 6%, if you would get an equivalent improvement in the environment? While the other one is, would you be willing to accept a $2,000 less annual income in order to improve the environment? So yes, over a period of time, you could say they're equivalent and work out a way in which they do match into each other. But people tend to have feelings about their own trade-offs between what they'd rather do now versus what they'd rather do later, what they'd rather see happen at a national level versus what they'd rather see happen to them as an individual, and you do get slightly different answers.
So it's kind of more of a question of scale, and your relation, growth is more about the general society versus income is more about your own personal.
Right.
Okay, we have the gentleman over there and the gentleman over here, so we'll get this gentleman the microphone for the second question.
Hi, good morning. I'm a foreign service officer that's just recently been assigned to Beijing, moving there in June. And my question is sort of a follow-up to his, but from a governmental perspective. And I'm wondering how fragile these models are with regards to economic development. That is, from the governmental perspective, again, if it slows down, do you see realistically a commitment from these governments, our partners in the East, to continued development of green technology as well as sustainable economies in the long run?
And go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I'm Ken Yates with Jefferson Waterman International, a consulting firm here in Washington. My question is one of technology. All projections tend to be smooth curves, but when you hit a bump in the road, particularly from a technological source, I wonder just how that will affect your projections. I have in mind a Brazilian innovation, which is called energy cane, which is carbon neutral in its use in its generation of power. And the carbon neutrality in power generation would have dramatic effects on a number of your curves that you've projected over the next decade or so. It's a technology that exists now, but it's in infancy. But particularly in places like Asia and Africa, which are tropical largely, it could be a very effective source for energy, which would throw those curves back down to a reasonable position, I believe. Thanks.
Okay. Sure. If the region slows down, what happens to the green impacts? how strong is the government's commitment? I believe the government's commitment is pretty strong. Of course, its strongest commitment seems to be to staying in power. But you know, these things tie into each other, and I think there is enough appreciation of the environmental impacts and the environmental costs of not addressing the environment. You know, the health costs, the costs to, well, you can invest billions of dollars in something like the Three Gorges Dam, but if it doesn't take proper account of the environmental impacts and it silts up within a couple of decades, you know, you may not get a decent return on your investment. So there's simple financial decisions too that argue for keeping account of the green aspects. Again, for the case of China, I'll defer to my colleague, but before I do that, on the projections and discrete changes, sure. You know, as I said, we're not willing to bet a lot of money on the accuracy of our projections, but we do find them useful for helping us to think about what may come up and to highlight some of the expectations. Carbon neutral power generation, I'm not a power technology person myself. My understanding is that things like solar power is pretty carbon neutral itself. Of course, in Asia, coal is the biggest source of power generation, and that is heavily carbon intensive.
There's a product called energy cane. So it's like sugar cane that doesn't have all the sucrose in it, and it's gasified, and from the gas you produce fuels. And that, because the cane absorbs an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide to that consumed or given off again in the process, it becomes a carbon neutral source of energy.
It sounds good, but we'd have to, you know, also look at the bigger picture. What are the impacts on food security if a lot of agricultural land gets shifted to this, something similar to the ethanol controversy in the U.S.?
The reason, of course, that doesn't take food producing lands can grow on what would be otherwise scrubland.
Okay.
Water and water.
Okay, we have a question, and we have two questions on this side. First a woman there, and then we'll come up here.
Janice Marconi, Marconi Works International, and yes, I am related to Marconi, but low on the DNA food chain. Thank you. Isn't there kind of like a paradox? The more companies that are involved in the manufacturing of solar products, just because of the rare earth minerals that are involved, the higher the pollution, just because of how intensive that extraction process is. And on top of that, the international companies that are over there, one may change policy within a certain degree within China, for example. But if the companies itself are kind of like somewhat immune to some of those policy changes, such as the solar panels and the rare earth mineral extraction, isn't that a quandary in itself that has to be solved?
And the gentleman right here.
James Sang, this has been a very aggregated, high-level view. On a more detailed view, for example, a whole bunch of questions come up. One, how does having 5 20 million people cities compare to having 40 2.5 million people cities in terms of sustainability and impact? Can one break things down to a finer level? Have you done that?
Okay. Yeah, in terms of the rare earth use in solar panels, is Sam here? No. We did have a colleague here at the beginning who knows more about the technology and would be able to answer you better. My guess is that, you know, if you're using the rare earths and you're going to have some negative impacts as well as positive ones, you need to try to get the prices right and incorporate the externalities, and hopefully that would encourage different sorts of technology development that did not have the same impact. But I couldn't.
Right now it doesn't. Right now, basically, it's the cheaper, the dirtiest extraction is still the one that's preferred.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the details of that, and I can't help you too much. The other one, which is better, five 20 million population cities versus 42.5 million. My guess is that the 42.5 million would have a lower environmental impact. But how would they stay that way? We don't know. I mean, the natural trends are for this pattern of cities that we observe. It's a pretty standard empirical regularity across the world. And it has to do partly in urban economic theory. There's discussion about systems of cities and how different types of industries or different size cities specialize in different types of industries. And therefore, you get this pattern of different sized cities to match up the production of different types of goods or services and trading among themselves as well as with other countries. And it's a pretty complicated pattern. So, if you're trying to constrain that to force things for one particular reason for the environment, you're likely to have other negative impacts, and you'd have to examine it in a much wider general equilibrium type approach, I think.
One,
not done that.
One observation I mentioned earlier that the largest growth in urbanization is taking place now in medium-sized cities, not in megacities. And one of the challenges of that is the absence of local government capacity. So while theoretically 20 cities of 2.5 million might be a more effective unit from the point of view of sustainability, what in reality has happened is quite often smaller cities don't have the capacity to begin to the political and administrative capacity to begin to deal with issues. So that's something that's happening right now in many parts of the world.
I mean, the other thing I was going to mention is that we see all these changes in methods of transportation, efficiency of transportation going on in the last 20 years and really going on into the future. And that presumably will change the dynamics of how cities interact.
Yes, definitely. Something else though with your 40 cities of 2.5 million would probably sprawl much more than one city or 5 cities of 20 million. And so in a place like China where you have a very limited amount of arable land, if you're losing much of that to urbanization, that could be a factor. There's a lot of different things to take into account.
Okay, I see one hand here, 2 hands. We'll take these, and let me just get a sense of the room. Are there other people who are going to want to speak? Okay, I think these will be the 2 final questions.
Marcia Goldberg, Marcia Goldberg, Association of American Geographers. Just a quick question, and it may be too far down in the weeds, but Washington has become obsessed with rent-a-bikes, as Paris has, and it struck me that China used to be, the cities used to be bicycle-oriented and pollution levels were low. So is there any interest or drive to use their old technology, what they were good at before, and build on something that was really a lower, much lower emitting, and probably you could move faster on a bike these days than in a car, I would assume.
Okay, and right here.
Madhut Khan, USRA and NASA Earth Science Division. Are there any numbers on the total level of infrastructure investments globally per year? How much is that? And then there was a summit in Bellagio in 2007. I think Rockefeller Foundation had organized it, that argued that urban areas are inextricably tied to their rural communities because of the link between food production, water resource management, and urbanization. And you can reduce the rate of urbanization if you provided the facilities that most of these people are moving because of looking for jobs. So looking at urban areas just by themselves might not be very beneficial if you don't look at the rural agriculture economy. And so what is the scope of that? Because the political systems in developing countries tends to be divided between the urban elite and the feudal elite. And so I'm not sure if the national policies could be influenced by investments from international financial institutions or from the business community. Thank you.
Okay. Let me work backwards on those two. We're based in Manila, and in Manila you very much see this interaction between the urban elites and the feudal elites, the big landowning families. It's estimated that 17 families control over 80% of the economy. So yes, there is definitely concerns there. In terms of the investment, there are estimates of the investment needs, but they're pretty rough. There is not accurate data. Estimates that we have generated in ADB estimate that developing Asia needs about $750 billion of investment, infrastructure investment per year over the next decade. Well, needs, okay, needs is a value-lated term, of course. But to fulfill its expectations, let's say. While some other estimates are that current levels of investment are around $400 billion a year. And there's all the talk about, well, where's the money going to come from? Governments don't have enough. The private sector has it, but they don't want to take the political risks and tie up their capital for so long with all of the possibilities of what could happen in the meantime. So the generally accepted solution seems to be some sort of public-private partnership. But in practice, that gets quite messy, and the details need to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. So that there is work underway in that area. In terms of the bikes in China, sure, it is. I mean, it used to be you go to Beijing, and at every stoplight, it's just hundreds of bicycles backed up waiting for the light to change. Now it's hundreds of cars backed up. But there is some effort towards moving back to that. One thing you see a lot in Asia that you don't seem to see much here is electric bicycles, where they have a little capacity. Again, I'm not a technology person, but it's something where the pedaling helps to generate some power that gets stored up, and then that can help when you need to go uphill or things where you need some assistance on it. Some cities in Asia are introducing bike lanes. There is some movement towards that, but it tends to be pretty slow. But perhaps in closing, since your question was really about China, and there was another one earlier on China, I could let my colleague have a word.
Okay, if we can get the microphone here.
On the bikes, there are a couple of cities already doing that. Some of you will know in Hangzhou, it's a very famous tourist city, has been really using bike. And this morning I saw the bike tracks in DC here, and I was asking, they told me actually they charge, unless within certain time limit you charge much less. But in Hangzhou it's actually free. Yeah, as long as you return, of course. There are initiatives, but there are a lot of other initiatives in China as well, like for the public transport and taxis. They actually mandatory required to use gas in some cities already, and they're building up gas stations instead of petroleum stations to fuel them. So there are a lot of initiatives there, and we do have some data and examples in the actual report. Earlier, someone mentioned about slowdown and green growth, and there's a trade-off. Yeah, I guess to some extent that is true. China inevitably will slow down. We don't know yet whether it's going to be soft or hard landing, but it's unlikely we'll continue to see double-digit growth in the future. But for many years, China has been sticking to 8% growth for a long time. This is not really related to other issues, but it's really related to the job market, which relates to the stability of the whole country. You can do a very simple number crunching to find why China need to maintain 8%. Otherwise, China will be in big trouble, not in growth, but really in social stability. Now, China has dropped to below 8%, and we don't know whether it's going to bump back. Somebody asked me, the bit longer term. I mean, at the moment, it's the whole globe. China has its own problems because it really relied on trade for such a long time, and they did not really try to develop the domestic market. In the long term, they probably can maintain about 8% for several decades. That's my personal own view on that. Green economy, if they slow down, I guess China will continue to do that because they do see that's a feature. I mean, not only for the Chinese economy, but for other economies, you got to go through the green path. China has invested a lot. I think China might be the largest investor in green research at the moment. We do have some numbers in the report as well. So if they do already put a lot of investment in the research, not just importing, that really means some kind of commitment. So I would think even growth slows down, China will continue that path.
Okay, I'm going to begin to wrap up. I want to thank Douglas and his colleagues from ADB, not only for their presentation, but for the report. This is clearly a subject that needs attention and growing attention. I want to go back to the observation about the differences between rural and urban areas. And I mentioned the World Urban Forum next week in Naples. One of the challenges that clearly has emerged as we think about these issues, and it's a conceptual and intellectual challenge, is that much of the urbanization now does not take place into what we think of as formal cities. People move, they're still connected to rural areas. They've always been, it turns out, but we have conceptual frameworks that are very much based on social science traditions, which tended to see people moving from point A to point B, and point B was something that was defined as a city. And now with the large numbers of people living in so-called peri-urban areas, informal settlements around cities, policies which view a distinction, a sharp line between urban policy and rural policy really don't begin to help you understand what's taking place. And unfortunately, for reasons we've alluded to, the political systems in many local areas are even more deeply entrenched on clear definitions between urban and rural. So these are challenges which are huge. Now that humankind is an urban animal, more than half of us live in cities, and you saw the projection lines. We are no longer rural. These challenges are all going to become much more important, and therefore I think it really is a moment worth noting that ADB has put out this report, and I'd like to thank you and your colleagues. I'd like to thank Sandy Foe for getting us here and the people who help with the microphones. This is a crowded, awkward room, so thank you all.